Good morning, church. Good to see you this morning. A frosty morning, but it's starting to feel like winter, so I kind of love it at the moment. But I know it's not everyone's cup of tea, so I hope you brought your blankets, your sweaters, your fuzzy socks. Those are allowed in church as well. I got to tell you, it was an exciting morning as it was, but when Will got up here and did an amazing job with communion, and he said, I'm thinking about, the whole part, I don't know about being a father. I was like, is he about to announce something? You had me, dude. I was like, Lord's Supper, unusual place, but I guess I'm here for it, so whatever, eventually. Appreciate that. Really good job. Love the time we get together with our brothers and sisters in Christ, and we can worship God with great joy, because it should be joyous. God's given us so much, it needs to be joyous. And so I appreciate the moments we have for that. Today's lesson is called Open Doors. We are talking about putting Jesus first. That's our theme for the year, Jesus first. And last week we began on the idea that Jesus said, I am the door. I get you thinking, well, what doors is he opening? And we're going to look at that a little bit more today. And what I hope you think about in the midst of that is, what doors does he open for us collectively today? But also, what about you as an individual? I want to understand that as clear as possible. That reminded me of some of the things. I make no secret about the fact that I do love art and such. And I go back and I think about some of my favorite parts of it aren't just the masterpiece itself when it's finally done, but I like the framework, the planning that goes into it. I do like tracking down how they got to a certain point. What was the development like? What was the thinking like? And how many versions did you do? This is an early drawing of this very famous painting called The Death of Socrates. It was finished in 1787 by Jacques-Louis David. But he had several drafts over a number of years where he was developing it. And if you can look close at this image, you can tell, and it comes from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, that he's even put the leg of Socrates in a couple of different places because he's working it out the best way to do it, to present this classic story of where Socrates was put to death, and he has him receiving the hemlock where he would drink it and he would die as his punishment. But you can see that there's a development that's taking place. And even as you overlap them a little bit, there's some thinking that's going into this. Are the critical pieces in place? Does it carry on the narrative the way that it needs to? In this part of neoclassical painting, they're trying to get you to have a sense of devotion to history and nation and such. So there's a lesson that's usually taught in these things. And so is it communicating those effectively? It's not a new thing that people did in art. This was one a little bit before that. This is Anthony Van Dyck, and it's Christ and the Pharisees. Christ and the Pharisees. I love it when you look in the framework and you can see the history of it involved. You can even tell some of his influences if you're so into those things. And I know right now some people are like, please, dude, move on. But bear with me. You can see Rubens in this. You can see the line work in this. And he's putting the framework down. Are the pieces in the right place? Will this communicate the correct narrative? Will it build to a masterpiece? That's what I want us to think of today, because last week when we got to the idea of Jesus being the door, we went to Acts chapter 8, and there we saw the masterpiece of what's happening for the church. Wasn't it? This is the part where the church was under great persecution. If you go back there and read those first few verses, you know that Saul was persecuting the church and had letters to lock them up and to carry them on, and he was very determined to destroy Christianity. That was his determination, and he thought it was correct. But the church in that moment, thinking of Jesus first, thrived. A masterpiece of spiritual excellence, of what we should esteem to. And in that moment, despite being persecuted, these people continued to go out. They left Jerusalem, but wherever they went preaching Jesus. Their first thought was on Jesus and how they can continue the church. Even though someone was trying to destroy it, they said, no, we will grow and we will be exactly what Jesus wants us to be. To the point where Saul was converted. To the point where even when they wrestled with that, Barnabas came in and he said, no, he's one of us. Let's develop that relationship. And they kept developing that to the point that even when it was time where Saul, would be Paul, was going to be killed, they said, let's protect that guy. He's one of us. And then when the church was growing in Antioch, it was thriving. Barnabas went to get him once again, thriving, putting Jesus first. A masterpiece. I want us to go back and think about the framework. Masterpiece also in Acts 2, 4, and 5, the beginning of the church. Their sacrifices for one another. That we ought to obey God more than men, rather than men. That passage coming out of there. There's no other name under heaven which men might be saved, and their teaching and their preaching. The church growing, masterpiece. We're looking at that in terms of what happens when Jesus is first, but I kind of want to go back to the framework of it to say, how do we get to that point? I love seeing the big picture, the masterpiece, but how do we get there? Because if I understand how to get there, then I can participate in that and I can recreate that. Sometimes the picture's so big it's hard to do that, but if I can see the simpler framework, now I can get a place and make it more tangible, more personable. And I want to do that today with a very specific story in the Gospels. Because really it's the Old Testament and the Gospels that are establishing that framework for what the church is going to be. It's always been God's plan that there would be a church. It's been God's plan, and you can see the first mentions of Jesus all the way back in Genesis chapter 3. And all the way up through the Old Testament, there's this idea of what's coming, and it's going to be better. And even Jeremiah 31 said a new covenant is going to be coming, that your sins will be remembered no more. There was anticipation for that. There was a concept of maybe what that could be. There was the idea of the Messiah as the prophet, the priest, and the king. But here it is in the gospel where we're seeing that unfold, and it's becoming more obvious, more clear what the picture should be. It's a good place for us to grab a hold of it and say, yes, I can participate in this as well, because we want our congregation to be the masterpiece that God intended. Not for our own glory, but for His. For His. Do it right and do it well. That's what I hope we'll see in the story today. But we begin in John chapter 7 with these people that are pushing back against the idea of Jesus first. I mean, they're pushing hard, and it's shocking because this is religious people. These are supposed to be the people of God. It's the Pharisees. In John chapter 7, we get this encounter with the Pharisees in which Jesus has been doing some very good works, and Jesus has been influencing the people around him. And some people are starting to say, that's him. That's the Christ. That's the prophet, priest, and king we've been expecting. And his people are going out and they're teaching that the kingdom of heaven is at hand, but not everyone's into it. The Pharisees, some of the Pharisees anyhow, they're pushing back pretty hard. And they have this passage here in John chapter 7 and verse 47 because they'd sent these officers out to do something about Jesus. But these officers come back and they're like, they haven't done what the Pharisees wanted. And they said, why have you not brought him to him? In verse 45, the officers say in 46, no man ever spoke like this man. Then the Pharisees answered and said, are you also deceived? Have any of the rulers of the Pharisees believed in him? But this crowd that does not know the law is accursed. They're so driven in opposition to Jesus as the Christ that when these officers come back and they're trying to say, there's evidence here. No man has ever spoke like him. Their rebuttal is, are you also deceived? Accusing Jesus of being a liar. The idea that he's the Christ is falsehood. It's blasphemy. Then they make this point, has any of the leaders, even the Pharisees, any of them acknowledged him? Now what's interesting is that the person who speaks up after this is Nicodemus. And Nicodemus is the same one from John chapter 3 who came to Jesus and seemed very interested. And so I think it's important for us to remember that not all the Pharisees were utterly opposed to Jesus. In fact, in Luke chapter 13, I believe it is, there's some that came to warn Jesus that Herod was trying to find him and kill him. And so not all Pharisees were super negative against him, but there was definitely a group that was determined to be in opposition to him, as we see here in Luke chapter 7. It gets worse. John chapter 7. John chapter 8, Jesus is confronting them. Now, he's been doing some work and teaching. This is after, at the beginning of the chapter, you remember this is the woman caught in adultery, and they were ready to stone her. And Jesus shows it tremendous mercy and tells her to go and sin no more. And then there's this real push and pull. The Pharisees are trying to challenge him. But he pushes back in a very gracious and instructive way. But he points out something to them as striking. Opposition to Jesus first. He tells them, you are of your father, the devil. Now, can you imagine that? You hold yourself and people uphold you as the definitive religious people, the teachers. The ones, if you want to know the law, you're the people they're supposed to go to. If you want to know what following God looks like, it's supposed to be these guys. But now Jesus is saying, you are of your father, the devil. They're in opposition to him. He even says you have the same desires. The desires of your father you want to do. Now, that's a gracious thing to tell someone because it could be corrective and instructive, but their hearts are hard. And they've turned their minds off to the idea that he could be the one fulfilling Scripture. If they are the experts in the law and the prophets, if they are the people who knew the Old Testament, then they should be paying attention and listening to Moses and the prophets because it points to Jesus. But they've hardened their hearts. They've hardened their hearts. And he builds on that in later passages and points it out to them. This is taking place over a period of time. And he's given them these opportunities to turn away from their falsehood and their opposition to him. But they're not listening. And one of the reasons here is John chapter 12, 42 and 43. For they love the praise of men more than the praise of God. Ouch. Can you imagine? You are the religious teachers. You are supposed to be exemplifying what it means to live under the law. But you love the praise of men more than the praise of God? You stand in opposition to the Messiah? You are after your father, the devil, and his desires is what you want? And in John chapter 11, verse 47, even after Jesus, I think this helps us give it an even better context of it, more pointed. Jesus has just raised Lazarus from the dead, raised a man from the dead. How much more do you need to see that this is a man of God or something worth listening to here? But instead of leaning into it, they oppose even more. And in John chapter 11, verse 47, we find out they've been meeting with the chief priests, and their determination is not to draw closer to Jesus, thinking maybe this is the guy the law and the prophets pointed to. But instead, the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered a council, and they said, "What shall we do? For this man works many signs. If we let him alone like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and nation." Can you imagine? You are the religious leaders exemplifying what it's supposed to look like. But your concern is not God. Your concern is not truth. Your concern is the power of some nation that may hold you back. Does that not draw your mind back to the Old Testament? And this unfortunate lineage of limiting what you conceive God will do for his people. If you were truly believers in the Old Testament law and you truly held on to that history and you truly believed in the promises of God, why would you ever think that some nation could hold you back? Why would you think Rome is greater than the power of God? Was it not God who delivered them out of Egyptian bondage? And was it not God who defended them against the Amorites and the Hittites and the Philistines and the Jebusites, and the list goes on? Was it not God who gave them the promised land? Was it not that history that they have in Numbers 13 and 14 when they sent in the 12 spies? 10 came back with a negative report. Failures. A failure of faith. That's in their history. And 2 came back saying, yes, it looks impossible, but not with God. Not with God. Why wasn't that sinking in? They've hardened their hearts. Because God's not first in their lives. Because they're putting the concerns of the world, the praise of men, they're putting their own self-interest first. And it's having this incredible limiting effect on their ability to be God's people. It's a choice that they're doing. It will go on, John 18 and verse 3, and it's the chief priests and the Pharisees who sent officers to go get Jesus in the betrayal. This particular group of Pharisees are very determined to contrast with the positions of God, to be in opposition to the Christ. They are not of God, and Jesus was not first in their lives. This is instructive. This is very instructive of what not to be. Even if people think that you are the most religious and you should exemplify it, they can think it, but are you truly that? Are you truly that in your thinking and in your heart and in your actions? Instructive. In John 9, we get a really good contrast to this. And this is really the heavy part of what we're going to talk about today, the framework. What do you do? That was the negative that we're contrasting against. But what do you do? In John chapter 9, we have this moment in which the disciples have asked Jesus if this blind man, if he sinned or his parents sinned, that caused him to have this blindness. And Jesus says to them, neither this man nor his parents sinned, but that the works of God should be revealed in him. I must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. The night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, verse 5, I am the light of the world. I am the light of the world. Instructive. Jesus is going to open these doors for people who are living in darkness. Yes, the blind man, because Jesus will put clay in his eyes and tell him to go wash in the pool of Siloam, and the guy's going to do it. And because he obeys Jesus in this moment, he receives his sight. He only saw darkness before, maybe at best blurry, dim world around him. And he lived in darkness in many ways, because you can think of the limitations he would have had at that time period. We have a lot of medical procedures. We have a lot of things that help people that may be blind. They did not have those things. He might have been shunned. He might have been left as a beggar. He would have been viewed as other. And Jesus is opening this door to give him possibilities he's never had before. That's incredible. It's being light in that way. So we're using it in a literal sense for sure. There's a metaphorical sense that's unfolding as well, because even in this picture, there's people in the background that are observing, that are watching and trying to figure out what's going on. They're trying to make sense of Jesus, and that's okay. You want people to try to make sense of Jesus as long as you're doing it in the direction that leads them towards God. So he's trying to illuminate their lives as well and bring light to them, and that's really where we get into what's going on with this. Whether it's the neighbors or the Pharisees, Jesus is given opportunities in providing light, the framework of what we're looking at. And this is instructive for us, and this is the part where I really want us to think. Yes, we've got the Pharisees in the background there, but also we have this thing to do. And that's what I'm interested in. What do I do as a Christian to put Jesus first? How can this passage in the Gospels be the framework for what I can do on a regular basis, a daily basis? And it's very relatable. It's very relatable. Jesus is very giving in this moment, certainly to give him the ability to see, but that's not the only thing Jesus has given him. There's a choice that's presented, and that's much more generous and powerful, spiritually speaking. Let's read this passage for just a little bit. Let's pick up in verse 8. After he's received his sight. That's the big event, but the afterwards is really where you see it take effect. Therefore, the neighbors and those who previously had seen that he was blind said, is not this who sat and begged? Is that not the beggar? And some said, this is he, and others said, he's like him. And the guy standing, he's like, I am he. Therefore, they said to him, how were your eyes open? That's a good question. And he answered and said, a man called Jesus made clay and anointed my eyes. And he said to me, go to the pool of Siloam and wash. So I went and washed, and I received sight. And they said to him, where is he? It's a good question. And he said, I don't know. But then they brought him who formerly was blind to the Pharisees. Now, I don't know the reasoning on this. We've already seen from the past few chapters where the Pharisees kind of are with regard to Jesus, so maybe it's tied to that. But they're going to bring this example to the Pharisees. And it was the Sabbath when Jesus made the clay and opened his eyes, so looks pretty negative for the reason they would bring him there. Then the Pharisees also asked him again how he had received his sight. And he said to them, he put clay in my eyes, I washed, and I see. Therefore, some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God, because he does not keep the Sabbath. Others said, how can a man who is a sinner do such signs? And there was division among them. And they said to the blind man again, what do you say about him because he opened your eyes? And he said, he's a prophet. But the Jews did not believe concerning him that he had been blind and received his sight, until they called the parents of him who had received his sight. And they asked him, saying, is your son, who you say born blind, and now he sees? And his parents said to them, we know that this is our son, and that he was born blind. But by what means he now sees, we do not know, or who opened his eyes, we do not know. He is of age, ask him. He will speak for himself. His parents said these things because they feared the Jews, for the Jews had agreed already that if anyone confessed that he was the Christ, he would be put out of the synagogue. Therefore, his parents said, he is of age, ask him. Okay, we've got several things going on. We'll stop there for now. We have this way of thinking unfolding, and that's really what I want you to pursue. How are you going to use your brain? And how are these people are using their mind in an approach to Jesus, especially living with Jesus first? Now, this guy who was a beggar and who was blind, this is it. This is his encounter. And it's very generous on Jesus' part, exceptionally generous, that he would use the power of God to allow him to have sight. But it doesn't stop there, because when we talk about Christianity, we have a relationship with Jesus. It's ongoing. It's ongoing. It doesn't just stop with one moment and that's it. It's not as if when a person becomes baptized, that's it. You don't have to go to church anymore. No, you're just starting, man. You're just starting. And so this guy is really early in his encounter with Jesus, his interaction with Jesus, and the great blessing that's given to him in this moment is choice. Your thinking will help determine your choice relative to Jesus. Choose wisely. The Pharisees have had these same choices, much more. They're well versed in the Old Testament scriptures, exceptionally so that they were the teachers. But they're choosing other things first. This guy early on is getting to choose Jesus first, if that's the decision he makes. He will have struggles in that presented to him. So, what we see him doing that I think is worth noting exceptionally well in verses 11 and 15. When he's questioned about the situation, when he's asked how did it happen, he simply tells the truth. I was blind. Jesus came to me. He said, go to the pool of Siloam and wash. So I went and washed, and I received sight. Simple. He wasn't dramatizing it. He wasn't being performative about it. He wasn't doing some sort of sensationalistic storytelling with it at all. He simply presented what was true. Simple. I love that because he's not allowing any of these other factors to impact him presenting it. He wasn't trying to say this to elevate his own social standing. That would be a selfish thing first. He wasn't trying to do it in such a way that would put other people down. Negative, that was not very godly in and of itself. He wasn't trying to do it in any other thing other than, this is just a reality of what happened. Let me give the truth. I hope you appreciate that, just giving the truth. We live in an age when a lot of people can't just do that. If we turn on the news, you know there's editorializing that unfolds, and you're like, okay, it's in here somewhere. But you get a sensationalist view of it. You get a performative element of it. I just want to know the facts. And in talking about his relationship with Jesus to this point, all he does is give the facts. It is true that he was blind. It was true that Jesus showed up. It is true that Jesus rubbed the clay in his eyes, told him to go wash, and it is true that he can now see. Honest facts. But sometimes that holds us back because we allow these other influences to come in and we make a mess of the facts because we want to think about social concerns and political concerns and economic concerns and all those sort of things. And so we get away from the facts and truth. He just leaves the facts. It's very pure what's going on here. And he probably knows that he's being opposed in this. And he definitely is later on. They're asking these questions. They're bringing his parents in. They don't want to touch it. They don't want to touch it at all. Ask him. They put it off on him. But then the Pharisees bring him back and they start reviling him. It literally says that. We'll start in verse 24. So again, they called the man who was blind and they said, give God the glory. We know that this man is a sinner. So they're using the force of their influence and making these accusations against Jesus. Quite strong. He's a sinner. And he answered and said, whether he's a sinner or not, I do not know. One thing I know, that though I was blind, now I see. Sticking with the facts. Not his place to judge whether Jesus was a sinner or not. All I know is I couldn't see, now I can. Something's different here. They said to him, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? And he said, I told you already, you didn't listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciples? And then they reviled him. And they said, you are his disciple, but we are Moses' disciples. We know that God spoke to Moses. As for this fellow, we do not know where he is from. He's getting a lot of pushback. A lot of pushback. The man answered and said to him, why, this is a marvelous thing that you do not know where he's from, yet he has opened my eyes. Now we know that God does not hear sinners, but if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, he hears him. Since the world began, it has been unheard of that anyone opened the eyes of one who was born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. They answered and said to him, you were completely born in sins, and are you teaching us? And they cast him out. The contrast between the two figures here could not be stronger. This guy is trying to lead in and find reasons to draw closer to God, and they are trying to find reasons to push away from God. Where's Jesus first in your life? That should be coming to mind here. And they're saying, you are accursed, and you've been a sinner from the beginning, but us, they've elevated themselves and they're condescending to him, not of God. But the interesting thing here is he will not compromise. He will not compromise the truth. And when you think about the power positions here, it's incredible. The guy was a beggar. Nothing to indicate that he was highly educated. Most indicate that he was incredibly poor. Someone that would be ultimately ridiculed, ignored, maybe at best receive some coins from time to time. But here he is, and the religious teachers, the people, again, who should be exemplifying following God, are condescending him, looking down on him, judging him, and yet he gives the exemplary demonstration of faith. I will not compromise truth. The strength of that guy in that moment against this institution, against that history, against that social influence from the Pharisees. And he says, no, I will not say anything negative about the guy that just gave me my sight. I can't judge whether he's a sinner or not, but I can tell you what he did, and I can tell you that no one has done that before, and he must be from God. He's trying to find the reasons to say yes. Wouldn't compromise. What a beautiful framework to establish a masterpiece of godly living. Will not compromise. And it cost him. And some people would say, well, there you go. He chose poorly. They cast him out. But cast him out of what? Even the synagogue itself was not something originally set up in the Old Testament. It was accepted. As we know in Luke 4, Jesus often went to the synagogues. The Pharisees themselves were not an institution that was set up in the Old Testament. It seems like it came out of the intertestamental time period, but it seems okay. There were people that wanted to be experts in the law, and that was great. In fact, some of the things they did were exceptional. They did care for the poor. They did have a strenuous level of piety. They did have an exceptional level of study, for sure. But over time, it became corrupted as they began focusing on themselves and elevating themselves. You can read Matthew chapter 23 where Jesus gives the 7 woes to the Pharisees. But even in extra biblical texts like the Talmud, there is criticism of certain elements of the Pharisees. There's 7 things that are listed. 6 of them are fairly negative. In fact, there's a criticism of the Pharisees in the Talmud, the Jewish writings of it, that some like to bear burdens, not for a virtuous reason, but so that people could see them bearing burdens and elevate themselves up. They said some of them like to hold their heads down all the time, but it was to display their humility. They said some of them, the exact wording was really funny, they made themselves bleed by walking into walls, but it was because they were so concerned about their piety of making eye contact with a woman, that they would leave their heads down and walk into walls and hurt themselves. Silliness. There was a 7th when it talked about the ones who did love God and fear him and keep his commandments, so that's really good. But even within the framework of the Jewish teachings, there was criticisms of several of the negative things that came out of the Pharisaical mindset. Those things that would be actually opposed to God because they weren't thinking of God first. They're elevating themselves. And this was their move with this blind man. You want to agree with us? we'll cast you out. You won't condemn him as a sinner, we'll cast you out. We'll revile you. We'll try to find a way to bring your parents into it. But this guy won't compromise. Exceptional. What did he get cast out of? Well, not godliness. They don't have the right to cast him out of godliness. And so the interesting thing is what unfolds next. In this moment, he goes to Jesus. Or rather, Jesus is not far away. In verse 35, Jesus heard that they had cast him out, and when he had found him, he said to him, "Do you believe in the Son of God?" And he said, "Who is he, Lord, that I may believe in him?" And Jesus said to him, "You have both seen him, and it is he who is talking with you." And he said, "Lord, I believe." And he worshiped him. And Jesus said, "For judgment I have come into this world, that those who do not see may see, and those who see may be made blind." He went to Jesus. This passage also reminds us Jesus is never far. But I like this in terms of the framework to get to the masterpiece, because it reminds us, who do I go to first when I have a struggle in life? Who do I go to first when I have a blessing in life? And how do I approach Jesus? And how do I approach God? Could it be that I've been cast out of some social circle in the world? Maybe. But the way that you respond to that, well, did you go to Jesus for that first? You may be tempted for vengeance. I'll get them back, man. I'll get them back. I'll show them. But that's not the way of Jesus. So if I go to the way of Jesus first, then I'll approach that in a righteous way that glorifies him. Masterpiece. It may be that you have great concerns about world powers like they did with the Romans, that they're going to come down on you and make life very difficult. And so you begin compromising your faith and your beliefs. But hold on. Why not think of Jesus first? And remember his power, greater than all. Remember his authority, greater than all. Remember passages like this, that even though this guy was cast out, Jesus was not far away. Jesus heard about what happened, and Jesus cared. Jesus first. And so if I go to him, then the way that I'll handle those situations, even from an anxiety standpoint or a stress or a concern issue, it's in his hands. And anything that I have to do to react to that, I'll do it in the way that Jesus wants it to be done. No, I get it. Sometimes today you hear crazy things on the TV and you want to rage and you may yell at your TV and you turn it up so it's yelling back. But do you go to Jesus first about it? And even when those moments come up and you're like, oh, I'm getting so worked up about that, maybe turn it off. It'll be all right. Maybe go to Jesus in prayer. Go to God in prayer and say, Lord, may your wisdom be done. And if I'm reacting so negatively, Lord, help me not to react so much. And maybe it means I go to his word first. And I sit there and I start looking how to navigate those kind of things. This is the framework to build to the masterpiece. And it requires repeating and repeating and repeating so that I get to that point where I'm not fussed about it. I'm only going to present the truth of life in Jesus. And I'm never going to compromise, no matter the people that may oppose me. And I'm always going to go to him first in the situation. That is a beautiful framework. Now, I love it with these particular examples because this gets worked and reworked and done better until you get to that masterpiece portion. And it's really what we do often in life. Sometimes you're like, oh man, I could have done that better. Give yourself the space to accept that and then do better. Well, I didn't really nail it over here. This line doesn't look so good in my faith. Erase that, do it better. You're constantly going to be getting there, and over time, you will build it up individually and collectively to be exactly what God wanted us to be. Now, to be honest, some of you out there, you're incredible. You are incredible. Many of you are. And I learn from you. And I appreciate so much your faith and your dedication. And that's whether you're young or you're old, there's some incredible things that happen. I think we have to appreciate that in each other just as we appreciate it in this blind man. You got to learn to appreciate those things. And we all build it up together. It's the beauty of the church. So we get to those moments where even if we encounter a thing like Acts chapter 8, where we are persecuted and scattered, we'll say, I don't like this, but it's going to be all right. I'm just going to keep preaching the gospel. I don't enjoy the pain and the suffering, but it's going to be all right. Jesus isn't far, and we'll stand on his truth and never compromise. It may be that there's people that turn against you, tempt you, try to lead you away, but it's going to be all right when Jesus is first in our lives. Hold true to that. Don't ever compromise. And literally, anytime you have a situation come up, ask yourself, am I going to him first? Am I going to him first? If you follow that, you'll be all right. You will be all right. Today we want to close up and just offer the invitation. Today it may be that you don't feel like you are in the right relationship you could have with Jesus. You can do something about that. It could be that you put him far off and maybe you compromised on Jesus in some way. You can be forgiven. Don't bear that burden. He'll take it away. It just requires you to turn to him, to repent, to turn back from it. He will forgive. He died on the cross to make that possible, and he always keeps his promises, and he will be just and forgiving. It could be that you're not yet a Christian. You could be. It's not a difficult path. It's really not. You understand what it says in the Gospels about who he is and what he's done and the sacrifice that he made and what it means to follow him. It does require repentance. It does require acknowledge him as the Christ, the Son of God, and to dedicate, commit yourself to it. It does require that you're baptized for the remission of your sins. Not complicated. Water and gravity takes care of most of it. But your faith is critical. Your faith in him. And if that's a thing that you need help with, that we can spend time with, we'll be glad to do it. Love to do it. Anything we can do to support you, to love you, to be there for you, God's people wants to be there. God will be there. Just let us know as we stand and as we sing.